Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, and my name is Zul Verji from Blackwell's Bookshop, and on behalf of Blackwell's, I'd like to offer you all a very, very warm welcome to the magnificent settings of the Sheldonian Theatre. As the cliche goes, Steven Pinker needs no introduction, but for the sake of form, let me tell you he is one of the world's most influential thinkers and writers. His books include The Better Angels of Our Nature, The Sense of Style, The Stuff of Thought, and many others. He is Harvard College professor and Johnston Family Professor of Psychology at Harvard University, and he is unsurprisingly the recipient of numerous awards and accolades. He's here, of course, to talk about his brand new book, Enlightenment Now, and he's going to be in conversation with Ian Goldin, who is professor at the University of Oxford and was the founding director of the Oxford Martin School, just a stone's throw away. Ian is Professor of Globalization and Development and holds a professorial fellowship at Balliol College, and he is a senior fellow at the Oxford Martin School. Ladies and gentlemen, the format of this evening is that Stephen and Ian will be in conversation for around about 40 minutes, and then of course there will be a Q&A session for around 20 minutes or so, and that will be followed by the book signing and a chance to meet Stephen, so I'll say a little bit more about that at the very end. We're in for an intellectual treat, an invigorating experience, and I do urge you to join me, please, in a warm round of applause for our speakers. Thank you.
Good evening, and thanks to you all for coming, and particularly thanks to Steve for joining us this evening, and to Blackwell's for organizing what I absolutely agree with Zul will be a treat. To hear Steve talk and to be able to discuss with him some of the very deep thoughts that are behind this great new book that he's going to be focusing on tonight, Enlightenment Now. I'm just going to ask Steve to begin, for those of you that haven't yet read it, by briefly giving us an insight into why he wrote the book and what he thinks its main messages are.
The book began as an answer to the question, what should we believe in? If you're not a nationalist, if you're not religious, if you're not a Marxist, is there any way of articulating what you think we should do about the human predicament? And I suggested that we could do a lot worse than what I consider the ideals of the Enlightenment, namely reason, science, humanism, and progress. To wit, if we try to figure out how the world works, if we attempt to solve problems, the problems being defined by what makes people better off, what gives them long, healthy, happy, stimulating lives, then we can gradually succeed. The natural question is, well, that sounds fine in theory, but 250 years later, how did that Enlightenment thing work out? And the core of the book is an answer to that question, which is pretty well. That is, if you try to characterize human well-being over time, quantitatively, with data, you find that in just about any measure of human well-being that you can track, there have been dramatic improvements. We live longer, we are less susceptible to famine, to infectious disease, to war, to crime, all of the horsemen of the apocalypse. People have more leisure time, they have more access to knowledge, they're better educated, they are more prosperous. I then turn to the objections to Enlightenment ideals. It's hard to imagine that there could be a case against reason, because how could you state that case unless you were using reason? But there are people who believe that promoting reason is futile. Some people, indeed from my own field of cognitive psychology, who say that people are so inherently irrational that it is hopeless to try to make them more rational. And so I have a chapter in defense of reason. Again, paradoxically, there's no way to defend reason other than using reason, although that itself is a reason to use reason. A chapter defending science against some of its surprising enemies, not just fundamentalists and American right-wing politicians, but sectors of academia and intellectual life who blame science for many of society's ills and who are hostile to some of the ideals of scientific investigation, and a chapter on humanism. Once again, one might wonder whether such a defense would be necessary. Who could possibly be against human flourishing? But in fact, there are alternatives to humanism, including theistic morality, the idea that without a belief in God, there is no source for ethics and morality, right and wrong, and a family of belief systems that extol kind of romantic heroism, that the well-being of the mass of humanity is a bourgeois, boring concept, and what we ought to foster is greatness, great genius, national glory, all of which are really alternatives to humanism, and I defend humanism in the face of these, I consider, surprising objections, but it is a case that I thought needed to be made.
Let's begin with the title. Why did you call the book Enlightenment Now, and how do you feel about those that suggest Enlightenment wasn't all good news, that slavery was entrenched, that imperialism started, that racism and anti-Semitism seemed to be institutionalized, and that there were many other bad elements of Enlightenment? So what is it about the Enlightenment that you feel we should evoke when we think about the present time and the future?
Yeah, I chose the title not because I wanted to give credit to a bunch of guys who wrote in the second half of the 18th century, or that I was doing the historical analysis that said that, that all of these improvements can be traced to that particular historical period. For one thing, they disagreed with one another. There is no official Enlightenment creed. Together with many of the brilliant ideas that they originated in advance, there were plenty of daffy ones. In fact, there were plenty of questions that they tried to answer that are almost incoherent to us today as questions. So the idea wasn't to praise Hume and Kant and Smith and Voltaire et al. I needed a name for this set of values, namely reason, science, humanism, and progress, and the Enlightenment seemed a fitting one. I could have called it secular humanism now, or the open society now, or cosmopolitan liberalism now, but Enlightenment Now did seem catchier, and had and it has an important kernel of intellectual historical accuracy, I would argue. I thought I had anticipated the major objections to the book's key ideas, simply because I had presented them in enough forums that I heard the objections and added chapters to the book to try to anticipate them. But one that I did not anticipate was one that blamed the Enlightenment for racism and slavery and imperialism, which I thought was just too bizarre to have occurred to me. For one thing, well, slavery. I mean, anyone who's been to a Passover Seder knows that slavery existed well before the 18th century. Anyone who's seen the movie Spartacus, slavery was the rule, not the exception, since the dawn of civilization, as was imperial conquest. You know, I came, I saw, I conquered. That was basically the rule of thumb for leaders who could get away with it for most of human history. It was with the Enlightenment that you had the first systematic arguments against slavery and against imperialism. I came across a book too late called Enlightenment Against Empire, noting that people like Condorcet and Smith and others had, as opposed to some of the earlier, there were scattered objections to some imperial practices, some from priests and from various humanists, but a coherent claim that Europe does not have a right to rule the world really originated with Enlightenment thinkers. So that kind of objection is almost perversely backward, and I, in a reply to the various critics and attackers of Enlightenment Now that I published a couple of months ago in Quillette called Enlightenment Wars, I reproduce a graph that I originally published in The Better Angels of Our Nature on the timeline for the abolition of slavery. And the shape of the graph looks like that. And the inflection point was the second half of the 18th century. That's when countries first started to abolish slavery. No one seemed to think that anything was wrong with it until around the time of the Enlightenment.
So Enlightenment was the beginning of a lot of good news, you would argue.
Yes, and it's not crucial to the argument that everything began in the 18th century or could be attributed to thinkers of that era. Again, it's really a defense of, the subtitle captures the content of the book better than the title. The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress. What's the best label for that quartet of ideals? And I would say the Enlightenment.
You know, I'd certainly agree with you, having written a book on why we live in a new Renaissance, which looks even further back. The central thrust of the book is about the case for reason and progress, and you make this extraordinary series of very revealing displays of data which show that, and yet we all feel so gloomy. What I've come to think about, and many others do, is the Pinker paradox. Why, if things are getting so good, do we all feel so bad? How do you make sense of that?
Yes, there's a peculiar gap in conventional wisdom that's been known for a long time by experts in polling, subject of a recent book by Brian Duffy called The Perils of Perception. He's one of the data scientists at Ipsos Mori. But it's been known for quite some time, which is that you get a wide discrepancy between how people judge their own lives and how they judge the lives of everyone else. You ask people, how would you place yourself on a scale of say, 1 to 10 in happiness, where 10 is the best possible life, 1 is the worst possible life? Most people would say that they're reasonably happy, 7 or 8. And you say, how happy do you think the average citizen in your country is? And they say, oh, the lives of quiet desperation, mass of men, 4 or 5, big gap. And you get the same gap in judgments of safety, in judgments of poverty, in judgments of other beliefs such as political liberalism. People judge everyone else to be more conservative than they judge themselves and more conservative than they in fact are. So that's a phenomenon that it isn't, the fact that people think that the country is going down the drain doesn't by itself mean that everyone is miserable. That in many cases, it's their intellectualized opinion of the state of society, not an assessment of their own lives. But also and as an explanation for what's sometimes called the optimism gap, or the I'm okay, they're not paradox, the perils of perception, is the fact that our access to the world comes through journalism, and journalism has some inherent biases toward the negative. Namely, journalism is about things that happen, not things that don't happen, and it's much easier for something to go wrong very quickly than to go right very quickly. Something can blow up, there can be a rampage shooter, there can be a disease outbreak. There's no equivalent in terms of the time scale of good things that happen. They creep up. As Max Roser, one of your faculty, not here tonight, put it, the papers could have run the headline, 137,000 people escaped from extreme poverty yesterday, every day for the last 30 years. But they never ran that headline because it didn't happen on a particular Thursday in October uniquely. And as a result, 1.25 billion people escaped from extreme poverty, and no one knows about it. Together with the inherent bias toward the negative that comes just from the nature of journalism, peace is not news, prosperity is not news. There is, as part of the ethos of journalism, a mission to focus on the negative, and I've discovered this in conversation with many journalists because I'm part of an effort to promote a more constructive, solutions-oriented, data-driven journalism. But journalists will say, well, good news, it's human interest fluff. It's, a puppy befriends orangutan. Cop buys groceries for mom on welfare. Or it's government propaganda. pig iron yields up 27% thanks to 5-year plan, or it's corporate PR. So the mere concept that anything can improve is alien to the culture of journalism. We consider it kind of selling out, or where the moralistic mission of journalism is to just rake the muck, speak truth to power. Now, of course, those are invaluable things. How are we to know about crises and suffering and injustices if not for journalism? But if it is purely driven, I argue, by events, particularly disasters, crises, threats, then it can lead not only to a factual misunderstanding of the state of the world and the trajectory of the world, but to some attitudes that can be as corrosive as complacency, which is the main fear of journalism. It can lead to fatalism, to the idea that we are cooked, the poor will always be with you. It's human nature to go to war, so it's romantic or utopian or idealistic to try to improve the human condition. And it can lead to a kind of radical nihilism, that we should smash the machine, burn the empire to the ground. It couldn't get any worse, so anything that rises out of the rubble is bound to be better than what we have now. And those are complementary threats to the danger of complacency. And what I argue for is not optimistic news or positive news, but just accurate news that is driven by data as much as by events. I would imagine, and I have pushed this idea on journalists so far to no avail, that the news section should take a leaf from the book of the financial pages and the sports pages and the weather, which is they report what happens every day. The stock market, the commodity prices, the scores, the standings, the weather. You don't just have a headline on the weather when there is a tornado approaching. You don't have the financial pages only covering crashes. You get it every single day. So why not have a dashboard for the world where we can track vital statistics like the crime rate, like carbon emissions, like global poverty, like battle deaths, on a designated portion of the news day in, day out, so we can track the ups and the downs.
It's a great thing. Maybe Max and Our World in Data can do that if the journalists won't. In the book, you say, intellectuals hate progress. Intellectuals who call themselves progressive rarely hate progress. Are we part of the problem? And I mean, I think of you as a progressive intellectual.
Yes.
Presumably your friends are.
No, and that did get a lot of people's backs up. People took it quite personally, saying the two responses are, how dare you say that intellectuals hate progress? And how dare you say there's been progress? Of course, not all intellectuals all the time, and not all progressives, but there is, and the enthusiasm for the idea of progress does show waves. It was obviously quite high during the Enlightenment itself, and there have been periods in history where there has been constructive hopes for progress, and there continues to be in many sectors of the academy. But there is in certain subcultures of academia and intellectual life, a dark, fatalistic view of society is the coin of the realm. And there are a number of major schools of intellectual life that are founded on the idea that society Western society is circling the drain. It's behind existentialism, the critical theory, the Frankfurt School, the ideas of Nietzsche and Toynbee, and there are many all-stars of the academy who have just built their oeuvre on the assumption that we're spiraling downward and it will soon all collapse.
Isn't that equally or even more an assumption of the right? I mean, the creation of fake news, the anti-climate, the anti-vaccine, and all of that. There's not a preserve of the left, is it?
Oh, by no means. And in fact, Orthodox Marxists would very much believe in progress. I mean, not a kind that I would particularly endorse. It would culminate in the and a kind of Marxist utopia and the withering of the state and so on. And indeed, some of the most dystopian rhetoric that we've heard in recent years has come from the populist right. In the United States, Donald Trump's final campaign ad and his inaugural address, both probably written by Steve Bannon and Steve Miller, were deeply dystopian. His notorious Carnage speech, whose best summary came from ex-President George W. Bush, who summarized by saying, "That was weird shit."
Yeah.
But yes, it is the right, and indeed the declinism that has been common in many sectors of intellectual life since the second half of the 19th century has right-wing and left-wing versions. And by the way, when I say intellectual, say progress, of course, even the term intellectual, I mean, I've never called myself an intellectual. There's something very pretentious about that, and so...
If you're in France, you would be.
Yes, me. Very few scientists would call themselves intellectuals, but so I use the term with the conventional understanding that there is a kind of profession or profile of the professional intellectual, and it is often the schools like existentialism and critical theory and postmodernism that we associate with the word intellectual. It wasn't an indictment of everyone who thinks for a living. And indeed, one hostile review, perhaps sensing himself as an implicit target, accused the book of anti-intellectualism because of the fun I had at the expense of capital I intellectuals, by which I meant adherents of these various intellectual schools and fads.
The book's based on a premise that if we put facts in front of people and reason, that they will somehow act accordingly. Do you have evidence of that? And I mean, do we have, we walk to the edge of the cliff and we look over, and it seems from the experience of the wars, and it seems from the experience of too little being done too little, too late on climate change, that evidence alone doesn't make people act.
Yes. No, and as a cognitive psychologist, I would be the last to say that all you need to do is present people with facts and arguments, and they will see the light and become enlightened. Quite the contrary. We know that people's beliefs are often signals of the coalitions they belong to, signals of their virtue, comforting or dramatic stories. So it is absolutely not enough to present people with facts and arguments. There is a dark art of persuasion and cultural change, which I claim no competence in, of how people are swayed, how you do get widespread changes of opinion and conventional wisdom. I was not exercising those dark arts. This wasn't a work of mass persuasion or viral memes. I was trying to influence the people who are open to facts and reason, because many of them could be effective influencers, rhetoricians, politicians, public relations experts, people in advertising and in the spread of ideas. And they have to be persuaded of what they ought to be trying to, which opinions they ought to be trying to change. And what I argue is not that people will automatically fall under the sway of reason as soon as they're presented with evidence. But we are obviously capable of it, otherwise we couldn't be having this or any other rational discussion. We do know that there are certain norms and institutions and rules of the game that we voluntarily surrender to in order to become collectively more rational than any of us can be individually. For example, free speech, the right to criticize without being punished by violence. In science, peer review. In politics, checks and balances. In the criminal justice system, the right of representation by an attorney and trial by jury and presumption of innocence. All of these norms that we set up precisely because we can't appeal to the wisdom of a noble, virtuous king or judge or authority, knowing that being human, they will be susceptible to all of the follies and biases and illusions, but that there can be rules that we abide by that make us smarter than we would be individually. And I'll just throw in one more observation that I came across after Enlightenment Now was published. It was a study by a political scientist named Brendan Nyan, who did a study showing that people are, in fact, can often be persuaded by data when presented in the form of graphs, even when it comes to beliefs that are sacred to their political identity. And he did this warmed my heart, because in both Enlightenment Now and The Better Angels of Our Nature, I made a lot of the argument in the form of graphs. But he showed that if you take charged beliefs such as, are global temperatures increasing, and you state them in words, citing sources, the people on the political right are unimpressed. If you show them graphs, say 3 different data sets on global temperatures, and all of them obviously soaring, then a large percentage of them do change their minds. And conversely, if you take a belief that's sacred on the left, because he obviously had to do it with charged opinions on both sides, so he looked at data from the effects of the 2007 so-called surge in Iraq, where Bush increased the number of soldiers and did the number of attacks on civilians go down. Again, this was one of those emotionally charged hot-button issues where your beliefs can be predicted by where you stand on the political spectrum. And when he showed people on the left the graph, many of them changed their minds. So we shouldn't underestimate the power of data to change people's minds, even though it's often an uphill struggle.
One of the things that's happened over the last 10 years is that following the financial crisis, I think particularly, there's been a collapse of belief in experts and expertise. I had a fascinating debate with Michael Gove, who's one of the chief proponents of Brexit, where I said, I'm one of 500 economists that have signed a petition saying it's going to be a disaster for the UK economy. You can't find anyone of substance that says it's going to be a good idea. Why do you think Brexit's such a good idea? And his response was, you are the experts that have brought us the financial crisis. Why should anyone trust you? Do you feel that, and you see this in all the opinion polls, that faith in experts and expertise is declining? We've seen it in the anti-vax movement. We see it in a number of areas. Do you feel that, in a sense, we as experts have let people down, and that there's something we're doing that's wrong that makes us deserving of their lack of faith in us?
Yes. Well, there should not be faith in experts. There shouldn't be faith in anything. There should be justified belief. And so anyone who proclaims himself or herself to be an expert has to be able to demonstrate it by a track record of accurate predictions and by being able to point to the trail of evidence and arguments behind their proclamations. And so the self-anointed experts should clearly be humble in making predictions about inherently dynamic, unpredictable spheres, and there are many in macroeconomics where experts really shouldn't be making confident predictions, knowing what the size of the error bars and the potential for downsides. And there was a wicked satire of Michael Gove, and I'm blanking now on the columnist who wrote it, who made a kind of Govian argument that why should we entrust the flying of planes to trained pilots? Every time there's a plane crash, there's always a trained pilot at the controls.
Yeah.
Why should we have surgeons do our surgery? Every time a patient dies on the operating table, there is always an expert surgeon. So it's an idiotic argument. In the general, why should we trust experts? Experts, by definition, are the people that you should go to, but they do have to demonstrate their expertise. They can't be soothsayers or prognosticators themselves, but allow people to follow the train of argument and evidence and acknowledge their own fallibility in domains in which prediction truly is impossible.
The book is replete with examples of how things are getting better, but you also do identify some areas in which it's not, like on climate change. What do you make of the arguments of those like Martin Rees in his recent book, that although the number of risks might be declining, their possible magnitude and implications is increasing, and indeed might even be leading to existential risk?
Well, there's some particular realms in which we really do have to worry about global threats that may not have existed in the past, climate change being foremost, and the possibility of nuclear war being another. But as others have pointed out, including David Deutsch, who is here, I'm honored to see in the front row, there have been massive risks in the past that our ancestors were much more poorly equipped to face than we are today, with the ability to acquire new knowledge, to share it, with far more resilient and robust global networks of sharing knowledge. Famine being an example. The only famines that take place now are in war zones and the world's most remote regions, whereas in the past there were famines that devastated entire countries. No part of the world was immune. Now we have not only the ability to grow probably more calories than are good for us, since now we have the problem of obesity instead of famine, but we also have the ability to move it from region to region before it spoils. In the case of pandemics, we ought to be vigilant. There is a possibility of a repeat of the Spanish flu. But on the other hand, we've got knowledge of how disease is transmitted that is just unprecedented in human history. So we're also equipped to deal with threats that have always faced humanity. Not to downplay the very real threats that we face from nuclear war and climate change, I think there has been a new, can devolve into a parlor game of trying to think up ever-increasing numbers of existential risks. That I suppose it's good to be aware of some of them, but it can, I think, reach a point of reversing returns if people are so terrified that we're doomed. That if we manage to solve climate change, well, then we have to worry about artificial intelligence enslaving us.
Martin has highlighted that, yes.
And if you're too profligate in the number of ways the world can end, then you give rise to a kind of collapse anxiety where people just figure that we're doomed. There are just so many ways in which the world can end. Let's just enjoy ourselves while we can.
What do you make of the argument that not only, possibly are the number of ways in which the world may end increasing, but the number of actors is increasing because individuals or small groups for the first time in human history have the power that nation states monopolized before to create mass destruction through biopathogens or through other means. So we need to worry much more about individuals and small groups, and that's changed the nature of the risk landscape.
We do have to worry about them, although it still has not happened that one person has managed to bring down the internet, loose a pandemic. Because, and again, so we're dealing with hypotheticals, and there is a lot of ignorance, and we should obviously prepare for some of the worst case scenarios. But just speaking hypothetically, the fact that we've got, say, the ability to genetically engineer pathogens, we also have an awful lot of people who desperately want that not to happen. In general, likewise in the case of the threat that was thought to be a near certainty in the 1990s and in the first decade of the 21st century, namely nuclear terrorism. And I have a list of predictions that by 90% certainty, by no later than 1995, a terrorist will detonate an atomic bomb. Now, of course, maybe we're lucky, but there's prediction after prediction that was refuted, suggesting that there is some miscalibration. Again, I guess we're talking about experts again. And this did not happen by a streak of luck. It didn't happen because God is smiling on us. It did happen because people applied enough sensible precaution to lock down the nuclear weapons and fissile material, so it's not so as easy to purloin it as those thriller scenarios had it. Likewise, we shouldn't be complacent about pandemics. They really could occur. We should make public health networks more robust to early detection, to rapid development of vaccines, to better epidemiological understanding. We should do all of those things. And the fact that we have so many smart people doing those things is a reason not to surrender to the fear that there is one teenager in Bulgaria right now who inevitably will wipe out humanity. And that's sometimes the way the speculations tend to go.
What do you make of the argument that with increasing success and the number of people that are being lifted out of poverty, number of people connected in the world, moving from a world of maybe 200 million to 6 billion to 7 billion actors, that complexity is growing exponentially with that. And with the complexity, national governments, politicians are losing control. We feel that the pace of change is accelerating, and indeed it is. So that when you see a reaction of Trump or Brexit, this is just a response to rising complexity and accelerating change. How does your book make sense of those forces?
Oh, there's an argument that goes back at least to Future Shock in the early 1970s, the bestseller by Alan Toffler. Well, it's hard to evaluate complexity per se as a cause of something like Donald Trump. But certainly there is unsettling change. But as one economist put it, a transition period is a period between two transition periods. There's always transition, and I mentioned Future Shock just because the same arguments were made in the 1970s. And there were unsettling developments in the past, which often did give rise to extreme political reactions, and perhaps it's happening now. I don't think the sheer increase in the number of bodies is by itself going to overwhelm us with a world that we can't understand. And it's in terms of developments that are making the world more complex, we also have better tools for dealing with them. Artificial intelligence, data visualization, people trained in interdisciplinary ways of thinking. This is not a prediction that we will keep up with the complexity, but it's just a warning that we can't assume that the complexity will be unprecedented and beyond our all ability to try to track it.
One of the interpretations of your book is that in arguing that there's so much progress, that things are basically going the right way, you're also arguing for a continuation of the existing economic system, power relations that have brought us all this progress, globalization, and so forth. Is that a fair evaluation, or do you think that climate change, that other things should force us to think more radically about the nature of our economic organization and social organization? Are we basically doing the right thing, or do we need a radical rethink?
Well, we undoubtedly need a rethink, and we always will, because things will always change, and our current systems will always be imperfect and often much worse than imperfect in numerous ways. I generally think that the idea of bulldozing what we have and starting from scratch with some theoretician's idea of what would be an improvement is probably a bad idea, because none of us is smart enough to design an entire economy and government from the ground up, and that it's best to use the diversity of systems that we now have in the world as a kind of laboratory to see what has promise of working, what seems to be failing, to encourage experimentation, to hope that countries or states or provinces will try experiments, track them with data, see which ones work, adopt the as they say, the best practices. Clearly, the status quo should not be kept, never should be kept, just because there are always imperfections and there are always changes. Climate change would be an example. We obviously do not have a current governance structure that is adequate to the task of dealing with climate change. On the other hand, this does not mean that we should abolish capitalism and abolish nation states and have a world government, a supreme dictator who tells everyone exactly where to set their thermostats? Probably not. But we can look to past examples of the world rising to global challenges, such as the Montreal Protocol for chlorofluorocarbons, such as the Atmospheric Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, such as the abolition of the slave trade. See cases where the world did rise to the occasion, short of a world government or a radical revamping of all institutions. Look in economic systems, certainly not to Marxist systems, which have a pretty consistent track record of misery and oppression, but nor to the fantasy of a completely unregulated free market, which does not exist, probably for a good reason. And so, as best we can tell, the societies so far that are most successful are ones that combine a large degree of market freedom with a robust safety net, a considerable amount of redistribution, and a framework of regulation of externalities that almost by definition the market cannot address. So we can look to successful societies like Netherlands, Sweden, Norway, not to emulate them in all respects, but to try to zero in on what they're doing right, and conversely look at disasters like Venezuela and try not to copy them.
And would you, maybe this is too political, but the withdrawal of President Trump from the Paris Climate Agreement, from the nuclear non-proliferation agreement with Russia, presumably you'd see those as moves in the wrong direction.
Oh, yes. Those are not examples of progress.
So a little bit of gloom. We have about 20 minutes for questions and answers. We only have mics on this floor. It is being filmed as well, so don't ask questions that you don't want to be filmed. And if you're on the top floors and you want to ask a question, you'll need to come down to these lower floors. Please identify yourself. Who'd like to go first?
I just want to say that I completely believe in the optimism. I don't consider it. My question is, what do you think can we do against the anti-enlightenment powers that are emerging? I think Trump, Brazil, Poland, Hungary. Yeah.
The question from our friend from Syria is, what does Steve recommend we do about the anti-Enlightenment powers? And he cited Hungary and a few others.
Yes, so I should emphasize that I tend to balk at the characterization of the book as one of optimism, because that implies that there is just an attitude or a mindset of looking on the bright side or seeing the glass as half full. And there is some of that, but most of the argument of the book hinges not on urging people to change their attitude, but rather making them aware of facts that they probably were not aware of. And in fact, we know they're not aware of because surveys of opinion show that people have the exactly wrong beliefs about trajectories such as war deaths. People think they're increasing, they're decreasing, except in Syria, that being an exception until recently. People think the global poverty is increasing. In fact, it's decreasing. Hans Rosling has publicized many surveys showing that people are systematically mistaken about many global trends. And so I see the core of the book as just reminding people of what the facts are, not just urging them to cheer up and look at the bright side. But that wasn't your question. That was a part of the preamble. I honestly don't know what the most effective ways are to make the case for Enlightenment, cosmopolitanism, humanism, secularism. I do it in the only way that I'm hope that I'm competent at, in presenting arguments and data. I mentioned that data can be more effective than we might guess, but ultimately it will depend on translating some of the more intellectual data-based arguments into ideas that can travel into compelling narratives, charismatic leaders, and all of the other somewhat imponderable ways in which societies can change. That having been said, I'll mention one other. I suppose you could call this an optimistic take, that there are some widespread forces that are pushing back against populism, or will push back against populism, at least over the long term. The most obvious one is demographic, that support for populism falls off with generational cohort. Younger people were less likely to vote for Trump, less likely to vote for Brexit, less likely to vote for European populist parties. One could say, well, that doesn't matter if everyone becomes more populist as they get older, but that in fact is not correct. It is as the social scientists say, it's a cohort effect, not a life cycle effect. And so as the silent generation and the baby boomers exit the stage, and the millennials and Gen Xers and Gen Zers replace them, there will be a natural, somewhat of a movement away from populism. Also, we know that populism is negatively correlated with education, and the world is getting more educated. It's also correlated with one of the strongest gradients, at least in the United States, is geographic. People, or in particular, in the continuum from urban to suburban to exurban to rural, there is a monotonic increase in support for populism. And the world is moving to cities. So as the world is moving to cities, as they're getting better educated, as the generations turn over, there will be something of a movement away from populism, which is a reason to think that it does not, by default, represent the future.
Thank you very much. Cheers.
Gentleman over here.
In more than one book, certainly the one before, you have mentioned that in the evolutionary process, some changes are taking place in our brain, which are making us less aggressive and probably more tolerant. We don't see it. Can you explain a bit more of that?
Yeah, so the question was whether there are...
Was that question heard by everyone?
Yeah.
Okay, do you want to repeat the question as well?
Okay. The question is, are there evolutionary changes, or should we expect evolutionary changes in the brain that literally make us more peaceable, more cooperative, more reasonable? And if so, why aren't they apparent? Why aren't we seeing them? So I do deal with, in The Better Angels of Our Nature, which focused on violence, I considered the hypothesis that some of the historical declines in violence were driven literally by biological evolution in the technical sense of changes of gene frequency over time. That is, are genes that predispose people to violence being selected out, and is that why violence has declined? It's possible, but I doubt it, and it's not a hypothesis that we need to invoke to explain the historical changes in violence that we can observe, simply because of the fact that many of them occur far too rapidly to have been products of natural selection, which has a speed limit measured in generations, and many of the changes take place on the time scale of decades. For example, the great American crime decline, violent crime in the United States, fell by 50% in 8 years. That wasn't because violent people were dying and less violent people were taking over the population. In the memory of some people in this room, Germany went from one of the most bellicose, martial peoples in history to one of the most pacifist peoples in history. Again, not because of gene replacement, but because of changes in norms and institutions. So we know that dramatic changes can take place on historical timescales. I suggested in Better Angels of Our Nature that the most parsimonious explanation is that they account for all of the historical changes. Again, not dogmatically ruling out the possibility that we become more peaceful since the Middle Ages because our genomes have changed, but that we really don't need to invoke that as a change.
Thanks very much. It's good seeing on genes, Richard Dawkins here. Let me just see a show of hands. Okay. The woman over there.
There are some pretty powerful institutions making cases against Enlightenment, and I'm quite specifically thinking of Fox News and Sinclair Media. Why do they exist? Where have they come from, in your opinion? Because I know a lot of what you said seems a lot like common sense.
Yeah. There is, so I don't think, although I advocate the ideals of the Enlightenment, and I do believe they're the best way forward, I don't believe they come naturally to us. I don't think that we are, by constitution, Enlightenment thinkers. I think we can easily fall back on not so enlightened ways of thinking, such as tribalism, such as authoritarianism, such as demonization, such as magical thinking. That is what most naturally comes to us, and those are features of human nature that can certainly be amplified and indeed exploited. So the process of enlightenment is a never-ending challenge. I hope it's not a Sisyphean challenge. And I don't think it is, because I wouldn't say that exactly that there are ratchets of progress, but there are certain kinds of change that do seem to get traction, and once done are not so easily undone. I mean, to take some extreme examples, human sacrifice, which used to be ubiquitous across civilizations, and now there's no culture that systematically practices human sacrifice. Chattel slavery, dueling, criminalization of homosexuality continues to exist, but it is on its way out. There are other, or belief in demons, demonic possession. You can still find it. There are still exorcisms, but it is certainly less common among elites, and even Fox News doesn't promote exorcisms. So whatever. So though it's always a struggle to fight back against the parts of human nature that are contrary to Enlightenment principles, I think with the continuous effort, taking advantage of ability of consensuses to form around more enlightened ideals, I think there can be incremental progress.
Person that's with a black jacket on.
Hi, thank you for your talk. So I'm a psychology student here, and your book is a lot about statistics and data, and I feel like all we get taught in psychology is beware of how shaky statistics can be, and yeah, given the whole replication crisis in psychology, where a lot of stats are sort of being overturned, and so I was just wondering about sort of how you're trying to show a lot through data how since the Enlightenment, or given enlightened thinking, things are getting better. But I was wondering how we can be sure that's actually the enlightened thinking. Sort of, we can't really get a control condition where we take out the Enlightenment and then see what would have happened if we hadn't had enlightened thought, or sort of thought of reason. And sort of, yeah, thinking about other spurious variables potentially, and sort of, could it just be that the places that we've improved now, the places where people have improved, it could be due to having had more resources before, having more resources now. It could have been that we chanced upon technology, perhaps, and a lot of that was sort of due to chance, just technologies that allow for resources.
We've got a lot of questions and not much time.
Yeah, so could it just be that we have more resources now, and that's sort of one of the things, and not this enlightened rationalism that's actually resulting in the improvement of less death and poverty? And yeah, I was just wondering.
Well, it is always obligatory when citing data to question the integrity of the data, how representative they are, how accurate they are, what are the potential sources of bias. Which I try to do, since I generally will only cite data that have already passed through the sieve of peer review and more or less expert consensus. I use data in two ways in the book. The primary one is simply descriptive. It is reporting data to the extent that they have been gathered with a constant yardstick over time by investigators who have striven for that, just which way do the curves go? That is, they don't depend on inferential statistics that often require assumptions and are open to various kinds of questionable assumptions, sometimes chicanery. And the point of the book is not that there has been, in all cases, an inflection point in the second half of the 18th century. Often it looks that way, but if it's the 19th century or the 18th century, if it's the 17th century, the 19th century, that isn't really the thesis of the book. It is a defense of the Enlightenment ideals, not in particular that historical moment was itself pivotal. The second kind of statistical analysis that I sometimes reproduce try to get closer to the question of cause and effect, which is, of course, impossible to answer decisively with historical data, since the events of the world happened only once. We can't do a Monte Carlo simulation and run the world over and over again, changing a few things and tabulating the distribution. So in that case, the next best thing, since for all of the problems that are inherent in appealing to data, not appealing to data is much, much worse. Because anytime you use the word more or less or better or worse, you're already making a statistical claim. And so not appealing to data would just be saying, trust me, trust my intuition. And we know, as psychologists, that human intuition cannot be trusted when it comes to statistical matters. So the kind of analysis that is the closest that we can come to testing ideas about cause and effect usually comes from regression analyses, ideally cross-lagged ones that look at over time, namely, does some measure at time 1 predict some outcome at time 2, holding constant all of the other things that are covarying with it? And that is often frustratingly difficult to do because a lot of good things all happen at once, which is, I suggest, itself a vindication of the idea that there is something that we really ought to call progress that isn't some mystical force, but the very fact that there is such a massive correlation among indicators of human well-being over time and over space. The countries and the eras in which people are more prosperous also are ones in which they're better educated, also are ones in which there is greater gender equity, also is ones in which there's less violent crime. There are a lot of reasons in which that Norway is a really good place to live, and Togo not so much. Likewise, there are a lot of reasons why it's better to be alive in the 21st century than in the 15th century. It's hard to, the quantitative social scientists try to tease them apart by looking at cases where the correlation isn't perfect and seeing what is a leading indicator, say in a particular country, that predicts improvements in education or health or longevity or safety down the line. It's inexact, it depends on assumptions. Often it does not yield a perfectly unambiguous answer, but it is the best we can do, and it's far better than just falling back on intuitions or narratives.
The one bit of data that I'm really sorry that I can't ignore is that we've run out of time. It really has been a treat, Stephen. Thank you so much. Extraordinary and in its wide-ranging analysis, but also just wonderfully cheerful, which is a fantastic thing and much needed. I know many people had their hands up. Steve is very active on Twitter, SA Pinker, so I'm sure that if you engage with him there, he'll engage, and I'm at Ian_Goldin. We'll try and continue the conversation elsewhere. So apologies to those of you that haven't had a chance to ask questions, and thanks to Steve, who will sign copies of his book, for coming and spending this wonderful hour with us.